All right, welcome back to Historical Period 6. This is our second lecture in Period 6, and we're going to be talking about westward expansion and economic development. So this is the first of two westward expansion lectures. Like the title suggests, we're going to only focus on economic development, and then later on we're going to focus on social and cultural development. So since we're moving out west, our theme is migration and settlement. The learning objective is explain the causes and effects of the settlement of the West from 1877 to 1898. So, farming in the West. There are improvements in mechanization, helping agricultural production increase substantially, and it contributes to declines in food prices. So, the improvements, again, are the transcontinental railroads that are connecting all the different parts of the United States. We have the first Transcontinental Railroad completed in May 10th, 1869. The construction started from Sacramento and it was going east. And then likewise, there was construction that was starting from the east and it was going towards the west in Sacramento. They join at Promontory Point, Utah. And the picture that you see in the top left is the meeting of those two railroads with the Union Pacific. This line is going to be called the Central Pacific Line because there's going to be a Northern Pacific and a Southern Pacific line later on. So there are sod busters that are going to be our farmers in the Great Plains area. They had to adopt the dry farming techniques, and they were lobbying for irrigation projects for the governments to set up because there's not a lot of rainfall past a certain point in the Great Plains area. So it's the 100th degree meridian, which is our dividing line, where rainfall really begins to decrease. So you can see from the pictures in the bottom left that it looks very, very dry. So these new farming techniques are meant to get to the bottom of the soil very deep down so they get the nutrients in the soil and help those plant crops. This is going to be important later on in the 20th century because decades of these farming techniques are going to completely deplete the soil, make the soil very, very sandy because it's lost all of its nutrients, and it's going to result in the Dust Bowl in the 1920s and 30s. Now, the reason why food prices were starting to decline is because there was a higher supply. So the irrigation projects and the new farming techniques were allowing farmers to get more out of each harvest. And whenever there is more of something, the value of it goes down. So that's simple supply and demand. A higher supply is going to result in lower prices. And because the farmers spent a lot of money on all this new equipment and moving out west, the prices that their crops are yielding are not enough. And so their natural response is to plant more crops, which is going to yield lower and lower prices. They get stuck in this loop where they're only hurting themselves by continuing to farm more. All right, so we have the creation of farmers groups. Many farmers responded to the increasing consolidation in agricultural markets and their dependence on the evolving railroad system by creating local and regional cooperative organizations. The first one is the National Grange of Patrons of Husbandry in 1868, or we just call this the Grange. So they created cooperatives or co-ops to protect farmers from railroads and middlemen. So railroads had a habit of taking as much money from farmers as they could because they knew that the farmers were reliant on the railroads to transport their goods to market so that they could be sold. And so they were jacking up the prices on farmers, especially on the shorter lines where there was little competition and farmers needed an advocate. So that's why the Granger created these cooperatives where farmers could store their goods or their crops at a certain place and not be charged by the railroads. They were also lobbying for the governments to regulate the railroads and the rates that they were charging farmers. And in Munn versus Illinois, the Supreme Court case, it was ruled that the government can regulate industries of central infrastructure like the railroads. Another one of these groups is the Farmers Alliance. So they were in the Southeast, mostly active there. They are mostly political and economically active. They put together the Ocala platform in which they state their objectives. It's a very progressive, forward-thinking platform. They're calling for stuff like the regulation of railroads, the direct election of senators, and so all of these things in their platform are going to be adopted by other movements with similar mindsets. So we're thinking about the populists that we're going to see later on in the period. All right, so following the Civil War, government subsidies for transportation and communication systems helped open new markets in North America. We already know about the Trans-Pacific Railroads. The law was passed in the midst of the Civil War. It gave subsidies for railroad companies to build routes to the West. And one of the ways in which other industries were affected was the cattle industry. So in Texas, there would be cowboys that would drive cattle all the way up to Kansas or even as far as Chicago. And then from Chicago, the meat of the longhorns would be distributed across the United States. But the availability of the railroads and also the creation of the barbed wire is leading these cowboy drives to go on the decline. So obviously the railroads are going to make it cheaper and more effective, and the barbed wire is actually going to keep these cattle drives from going in their usual routes. Another way in which the government became involved was by giving similar subsidies to telegraph companies, and telegraphs were being set as new lines of railroads were being constructed. So the growth of the railroad industry paralleled the growth of the telegraph. And finally, railroads developed time zones. So this is separate from government action. And this was so that the trains would be able to continue to keep on schedule. So the Pacific, Mountain, Central, and Eastern time zones that we use in the continental United States today all arose because of the need for railroads to be more efficient and to allow people to know when their train was coming so that they wouldn't miss it. All right, so the building of transcontinental railroads, the discovery of mineral resources, and government policies promoted economic growth and created new communities and centers of commercial activities. We're going to focus solely here on mineral resources. So we've already talked about the gold rush in California in 1848 and 1849, and similar discoveries of mineral resources continue through the rest of the 19th century, and every time that there is a new discovery, it leads to the creation of a boom town. So boom towns are the towns that arose next to the area where the mineral deposits were found. And then as soon as those mineral deposits were depleted, they became ghost towns because people left them. They deserted them. Comstock Lode in Nevada was the largest silver deposit that was found in the 19th century, and the corresponding boomtown was called Virginia Hills, and it was as complete as any other city or town in the United States. It included schools, it included churches, it had proper infrastructure, so it's a lot more complete than our usual idea of a Western boomtown where it's only men that are going out there and there's just a bunch of saloons and houses and all the people do is mine. Yes, the mines were a central part to that town's economy, but there were a lot of other things that were also present in those towns. Now, the discovery of gold in the Black Hills in South Dakota are going to lead to further land dispossession of the Dakota Sioux. Now, the Black Hills had already been given to the Sioux in previous treaties after they had been dispossessed from other areas. And so, as first, it's individual prospectors going into the Black Hills and mining on their own, and the Sioux continue to ask the federal government to uphold their end of the treaty and kick those people out, prevent them from going into the Black Hills, and eventually they become dispossessed of most of their region that had been promised under their previous treaty. Eventually, the Sioux, after about 100 years of legal disputes with the United States, they won a settlement of, I think, over $15 billion, and currently it's still in dispute because the Sioux don't want the money, they want the land back, which might be more difficult than just taking the money. All right. So that was it. Here's our recap. Agricultural production increases and it leads to a drop in prices, really negatively affecting the farmers that are moving out west. Organizations for farmers, like the Grange and Farmers Alliance, are created as a response to these negative circumstances. The U.S. government heavily subsidized transportation and communication expansion. And finally, mineral resources drove economic growth where white settlers had not been before. All right, so that is it for this lecture. The next one is going to still be on westward expansion, but we're going to focus on the social and cultural effects of westward expansion. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.